Our futures are predestined. Mobius foretold mine eons ago. We each play out the parts fate has written for us. Free will is an illusion.
How much of your life do you have control over? There are always external factors in our lives that dictate our circumstances, but a core component of human behavior and consciousness is the idea that as sentient, highly intelligent animals, we have the free will to consider our place in the world and act of our own accord. But what if you knew that this was a lie? If all of the pivotal moments in your life were predestined, and that you were never truly in control? How could you go on, knowing that no matter how much sentience you felt you were in possession of, all past and future events would, and always will, happen exactly as they should? It's a question that many philosophers and metaphysicists have pondered, but with the way in which we perceive time in a linear fashion, there's no way to know if any of our actions are predestined, and, more importantly, if knowledge of this would allow us to change our fate. This is the question at the heart of the Legacy of Kain series, and Soul Reaver 2 is the first time this question is explored in a way where the consequences of trying to change one's destiny are fully explored and shown in detail. Raziel, having just missed his chance to take his revenge, follows Kain to a time in Nosgoth's past just before the corruption of the Pillars. Here, Mobius the Time Streamer tells Raziel of his supposed destiny, to finally kill Kain and allow balance to return to the world. But does Raziel really have the power to choose how and if any of these events take place? From this point on, we finally start to see some of the events and characters from Blood Omen from a new perspective, and gain a further insight into the grand scheme at work. Hello and welcome back to the Steam Pilgrimage and part 3 in the Legacy of Kain video series. First, I'd like to apologise for the delay in getting this video out. Due to the craziness of 2020, I was forced to leave my house and I was stuck without my usual gaming rig. Because of the particular hardware on the laptop that I was trying to use, I found getting Soul Reaver 2 to play basically impossible. But we're back and videos will be coming on a more consistent basis. Thank you all for your patience. Also, there was a slight glitch in my last video that made it sound like I was pronouncing Raziel like a fucking idiot. This glitch has now been fixed.
Raziel, Redeemer and Destroyer, Pawn and Messiah. Welcome, time-span soul. Welcome to your destiny.
Soul Reaver 2 picks up exactly where the first game ended, with the opening cinematic even being a remake of the ending from the first game. Once you take control of Raziel, the controls are immediately familiar, and Raziel has even retained all of the powers you spent so long trying to attain in the first game. This was actually such a refreshing piece of design to encounter in a sequel. Today, game franchises will find terrible ways to strip the player of their upgrades so they can introduce an almost identical progression system. A great example of this is the famous gap in logic of making you work for the grapple shot in Arkham Origins, even though the game is a prequel and Batman actually says that he just invented it in Arkham City. This design choice serves two purposes usually. It allows the developer to not have to worry about appealing to new audiences, as everyone starts back at zero, and it cuts back on the development time as half of the assets and features are already made and just have to be jazzed up a bit. The Legacy of Kain series were always made with the intention of being a grand and epic saga, sacrificing some of the accessibility for a more cohesive and complex narrative. This, however, is probably the reason why we won't be seeing another game in the franchise again, unless there's a concerted effort to remake the entire series from the start. Giving you the same abilities as the first game means that the developer had to add in some new element to keep the exploration and puzzles interesting. It's a well-known fact that a lot of the content was cut from the original Soul Reaver game, and a good portion of those mechanics made their way into the sequel. The biggest new additions are the Reaper infusions, elemental enhancements that give the Reaper different functionalities, like the Light Reaver being able to open doors with these crystals, or the Dark Reaver making bridges. And no, we're not going to go into the very liberal use of the term elements here. This game came out before Avatar, so we'll give them a pass, although the Nations of Light and Dark does actually sound pretty cool. Most of the time, this boils down to needing a certain type of Reaver to open a door or mechanism, but you can only have one infusion at a time. This leads to a sort of Portal-style juggling act where you have to plan your movements through the obstacle course and decide when you need to switch infusions to get to the end, usually in order to unlock the next infusion. Combat-wise, the game suffers from a lot of the same problems as the first game, with the hit detection being very inconsistent. The character models and hits also seem more floaty than last time, with impacts never feeling heavy or tangible. Thankfully, the camera has improved somewhat for better depth perception and less attacks from off-screen. The devs did fix one of my biggest complaints from the first game in that you no longer have to find ways to finish off enemies, as almost all the creatures you'll fight are either humans or demons. The way that the Soul Reaver blade works has also changed slightly. Instead of it only being available when you're at full health in the physical realm, it can now be used at any time, but prolonged use of it will cause damage to Raziel's health. You can still use your claws or weapons found in the environment, and I found this to be the most viable option as the Soul Reaver doesn't really do that much more damage than them. Of course, the combat has never really been the main focus of the Legacy of Kain series, taking a backseat to the exploration and fantastic narrative and world building. But there are times when fighting is necessary, so it being slightly less annoying in this one was very much appreciated, although it is a little bit more finicky. Aside from the changes to gameplay, there's the graphical improvement, which add much needed clarity to the character models. No longer does Kain look like his face was printed onto scrap paper and then hot glued onto a melted action figure. The environments also look much better and far less drab, with some nice variation on locations and settings. The world itself seemed a little bit less coherent than in the first game, losing the sandbox feel in favour of more isolated areas. But given the time-skipping nature of this game, it's probably for the better. And finally, the audio is just as good as ever here. The dynamic music system makes its way onto the PC release this time, and it makes a world of difference. Tracks build and recede as the action on screen necessitates, and gives the game some much needed nuance in the ambience. The music matches the game in such a fitting way that it has one of those doing it so right you don't really know it's happening kind of effects. And of course, that famous voice acting returns in all its glory with a slight upgrade to the quality and spatial effects. But even without this upgrade, the quality of the performances are enough to carry this game. Raziel, Kain and the Elder God are just as captivating as ever, delivering grandiose, reflective monologues without a hint of pretentiousness, which is no small feat in a time-traveling vampire drama about the existence of free will. Joining them this time is Richard Doyle as Mobius in a far more prominent role than he had before. His slimy back and forth between feeble, well-meaning crusader and evil mastermind is truly repulsive, in the best way possible. In terms of gameplay and presentation, Soul Reaver 2 is an improvement over the first game, but the signs of a rushed development cycle can still be seen somewhat in the lack of polish. Thankfully, no time seems to have been squandered in the writing though, as we'll now discuss.
This isn't a chase, Raziel. We are merely passengers on the wheel of destiny, describing a perfect circle to this point. We've been brought here for a reason. I've seen the beginning and the end of our story, however, and the tale is crude and ill-conceived. We must rewrite the ending of it. You and I.
After following Kain through the time portal, Raziel is taken from the time stream just after Kain arrives, or just before, I guess, depending on your orientation, to a time just before the pillars become corrupted. Mobius tells Raziel to find Kain and fulfill his destiny. Mobius then urges him to fight his way out of the Sarafin stronghold he finds himself in, and Raziel for the first time sees glimpses of the way his life was and the path the world could have taken. Before leaving, however, Raziel finds a physical manifestation of the Soul Reaver blade shattered. This is clearly the one used by William the Just in his fight against Kain. When coming into contact with it, however, he begins to feel a strange temporal distortion but can't understand what it is, with the Wraith blade somewhat intertwining with the spirit inside the physical manifestation. Less than assured that everything he was told was true, Raziel sets out to find Kain. And so he does, at the most fitting of places for a world soaked in its own sense of cruel irony. Raziel finds Kain at the still intact pillars, ready to strike and end the whole mess. Before he can act though, Kain senses Raziel and asks for a chance to explain himself. As the pillars crumble around him, Kain finally reveals everything that he knows about Mobius' plan. When Ariel died at the beginning of Blood Omen, Kain was born at the exact same time and chosen to be the new Guardian of Balance. But Nupraptor, finding the woman he loves dead, was driven insane, which polluted the minds of the rest of the Guardians, who were all linked together. So at the end of Blood Omen, when Kain was asked to make his choice of sacrifice or refusing to die, he was effectively rendered incapable of making the decision. And either outcome would eventually lead to the extinction of all vampires, whether he's sacrificed or killed centuries later. Two sides of the same coin. But Kain rejects these inevitabilities, telling Raziel to seek his true destiny before leaving.
But suppose you throw a coin enough times. Suppose one day it lands on its edge.
Just beyond the pillars, Raziel finds a door that can only be opened with the Reaver. Inside, he finds himself in an antechamber below the pillars, similar to where he first encountered Kain in Soul Reaver 1. Wall murals depict a race of winged blue creatures who seem to be the creators of the pillars. And underneath, deep in the water, the familiar Elder God resides. Smaller and less powerful, but he does seem to know at which point in his timeline Raziel currently is. Raziel uses the Elder God's apparent weakened state to tell him off and dismiss himself from his control.
You go, girl!
Traveling on, we find the first of the elemental forges and more murals, this time depicting the ancient blue race as having used the pillars to lock away some evil force. They also seem to have made the Soul Reaver blade. After speaking with Vorador, we learn that the creators depicted on the murals belonged to a now extinct race. The last of which, Janos Audron, was killed 500 years previously and was the person who turned Vorador into a vampire. Raziel continues to another forge, gaining the light infusion that allows him to open the gate back into the Sarafan stronghold. Waiting for him there, in front of the tomb of his old enemy William the Just, is Kain, and the temporal distortions begin again. Kain explains that this is the point in which Raziel is to finally kill Kain, and the blade begins to act on its own, forcing Raziel to strike Kain down with it and fulfill history as he was meant to do. However, at Kain's insistence to fight the urge, he instead plunges the sword into William's tomb, and a paradox is created, as history begins to shuffle to accommodate this revision. Kain explains that these temporal distortions are caused by having two copies of the Soul Reaver blade meet in space and time, and that this is how Mobius orchestrated the first time paradox in Blood Omen that eventually led to the vampire purges. Fun fact I didn't actually know until doing research for this video: in Blood Omen 1, when you face off against William, the devs have made it so that it's nearly impossible to finish him off without any weapon other than the Soul Reaver. This kind of detail really makes you wonder how much of this grand narrative was planned from the start. Emboldened by his ability to change his fate, Raziel tries to remove himself from the conflict entirely. Finding Mobius in his chambers, Raziel orders to be sent back to a time long before all of these problems and the world is at peace, and also in order to meet the creatures from the murals. Exiting the time-streaming chamber, however, he quickly realizes that he has been deceived and has ended up around 100 years into the future after the vampire hunts have concluded. Raziel sets out to find another time-streaming device. After finding the Air Temple, another mural depicts the ancient blue race being afflicted with a curse by the race of mysterious creatures that were locked behind the pillars. This curse seems to be the beginning of vampirism. Raziel decides he must travel back in time to meet the famous Janos Audron. Finding an abandoned time-streaming chamber, he uses the device and is suspiciously brought to the exact time period he sought after. Raziel fights the Sarafan, currently at the height of their original purge, and finds Janos Audron's hideaway. Navigating the labyrinth of mazes and puzzles, he eventually reaches the chamber where a lone, solemn figure, matching the depiction of the creatures from the murals, stands waiting. Janos Audron finally sheds light on Raziel's place in the world. Janos took up a place as the 10th guardian of the pillars, the keeper of the Soul Reaver blade. He's waited for Raziel for centuries, with his arrival being prophesied. He mentions that the pillars are some kind of a lock, with the Reaver being a key, and that a ritual joining of sorts must be fulfilled. When confronted with the blade, however, instead of the usual temporal distortion, Raziel feels a repulsion and a sense of dread. Before he can take the blade, the Sarafan, having followed him through the keep, attempt to storm in and kill them both. Janos teleports Raziel to safety, and he must quickly unlock the final element, the Fire Reaver, to open the door and help Janos. Unfortunately, it's too late, and he arrives just in time to find his own Sarafan self, a life that he has no recollection of, cut out Janos' heart. This is of course the Heart of Darkness, the relic you use in Blood Omen to restore health and stop yourself from dying. The Sarafan escape with the heart and the Reaver, and Raziel vows to return the heart and resurrect Janos. As he battles his way back to the stronghold, Raziel continues to be intercepted by demons who not only seem to know who he is, but also of his desire to change his destiny. In a room in the Sarafan stronghold, Raziel stumbles across the physical Soul Reaver blade, before turning to find Mobius and a currently flesh and bone Malik. Using his staff, Mobius disables Raziel's Wraith Blade, forcing him to take up the physical Reaver. A familiar cry from a room over reveals that we're standing just down the hall from the scene from the opening of Blood Omen, as Vorador is currently slaughtering the Sarafan Circle. It's now revealed that Malik failed to save them as he was instructed by Mobius to hold the door against Raziel. And we also now find out Vorador's reasoning for slaughtering them, the death of his master Janos Audrin. Raziel does eventually escape, and in yet another twist of irony is confronted by his former Sarafan brothers, millennia before they would all become Kain's vampire knights. One by one he cuts down his former soon-to-be brothers until eventually coming face to face with his former self, killing the last of the Sarafan and becoming the instrument through which Kain would eventually resurrect him in the future. At this moment, however, the Reaver takes control and impales Raziel, beginning to suck his life energy. A realization dawns that Raziel, in a cyclical loop of fate, was actually the spirit inside the Reaver the entire time, and that all events that had endured until this point were orchestrated to bring him to this moment so that he could become the titular Soul Reaver. However, at a pivotal moment in time, as Raziel's soul is both inside and outside of the blade, two instances of the Reaver come into contact and a temporal distortion starts to manifest. Kain, seeing his opportunity to affect time, pulls the Reaver from Raziel, once again changing the course of history. However, as time bends to accommodate this change, Kain's memories shift and alter, and in a panic, he warns Raziel of the Hilden and not to resurrect Janos. But it's too late, and before Raziel can heed his warning, he loses the strength to maintain his physical form. Awakening in the spirit realm, he finds the Reaver still attached, and it becomes clear that his destiny has not changed but only been postponed. As the end credits confirm, history abhors a paradox. The main focus of Soul Reaver 2 is the introduction of Kain and Raziel's plan to counteract the machinations that have been pushing them unwittingly throughout their lives. The way previously inconsequential narrative points have been spun into relevant twists is truly remarkable, and given the turbulent development of nearly every game in the series, it's tough to work out how much of all of this was planned from the beginning and how much was just careful gerrymandering of already established facts. One thing I found truly amazing was a single line of an item description from Blood Omen: Dark Souls eat your heart out. When talking about the Soul Reaver blade, Kain mentions having a certain kinship with it, seemingly talking about how they both lust after the life essence of others.
Time fades even legend, and the origin of Soul Reaver has been lost long ago. But its purpose remains: to feed on the souls of any creature it strikes. Kindred, this blade and I.
However, the revelation that the blade houses the soul of Raziel, the first of Kain's children, well, as always, the plot is full of delicious amounts of ironic twists to show that destiny itself seems to be the main antagonist of the piece. Not content with just forcing people to go along with things that they can't choose, but to make those events as painful and tragic as possible. The irony of Raziel being the one who killed his Sarafan brothers after the shocking revelation in the first game was quite obvious, but I particularly like the fact Raziel is seen as a messianic figure, a concept that is inherently bound to destiny. Yet he's seen as this because he is the only entity in possession of free will. Just beautiful. I think the standout part of this game, however, is the evolving relationship between Kain and Raziel. Beginning as initially distrustful of him for obvious reasons, Raziel begins to feel sorry for Kain and starts to realize how little control Kain has truly had over his entire life, essentially being set up to make an impossible choice and then becoming the scapegoat for the true villains. After being tricked by Mobius into the future, Raziel comes across the ghost of Ariel, the Balance Guardian who preceded Kain. Seeing her madness and vitriol towards Kain's refusal to sacrifice himself, Raziel ends up talking himself around to sympathizing with Kain's plight. The final moments of the game as Kain tells Raziel to give into the blade and trust him are actually quite touching. But the stage is now set for an epic showdown as we find out if Kain's plan has worked to disrupt the time stream enough to change both of their fates. But first is a small matter of the world-changing paradox that we just experienced. So before we can get to our conclusion, we first have to deal with the altered history that's been created in the red-headed stepchild of the Legacy of Kain series, Blood Omen 2.
It's all true then, what Kain and Vorador have told me. I really am some kind of unholy vampire messiah. Unholy? No. Messiah. perhaps. I don't like that word. It smells of martyrdom.
Looking online, it seems that Soul Reaver 2 is often an overlooked part of the series. People's favourite games tend to be either Soul Reaver 1 or Blood Omen 1, and I can see why. Blood Omen 2 is universally panned for good reason, and any talk of Defiance tends to end in a sort of lamenting for a true ending to the series. But Soul Reaver 2 very rarely gets a shout out, as it's kind of the pivot point in this story. Gameplay wise, it doesn't really do enough to upgrade itself over the first Soul Reaver game, but where it stands in the narrative is so important not only for the last two games in the series, but in how it finally put into context a lot of the hanging questions from the first two. Blood Omen 1 presented a self-contained story in which you had two possible endings, and Soul Reaver 1 took one of those endings and ran with it, setting up a lot of mystery and intrigue into how the first part of the series would fit into the rest of it. Soul Reaver 2 is where all of these questions are explored in detail, and it shows the links between the two games, as well as setting up just enough mystery to keep us enthralled on another cliffhanger. The way in which Soul Reaver 2 manages to recontextualize core moments from the first two games in the series is a testament to what good writing and foresight can achieve in a narrative in any medium. As with the last two games in the series, I highly recommend that you try to hunt this down and play it for yourself. On PC it can be a little bit tough to get it to work, although there are various patches you can get, and I'll put the one that I used in the description below. Another option is to emulate it if you have a PS2 emulator, but as always, if you're going to do so, please remember to buy a physical copy of the game before taking the ISO file off of it. I want to thank all of my subscribers for their patience in waiting for this installment to come out. If you're new to the channel and the idea of the Steam Pilgrimage, we're going to go through every single game on my Steam list and finally defeat our horrendous backlog that's just built up over the years. So if you want to see the next installment in the Legacy of Kain series, or if you want to see any more of my videos, you can check the channel down below, you can subscribe with the button, and if you really like the video, you can leave a thumbs up or a comment giving me feedback. What did I do good? What did I do bad? What do you want to see next? Let me know. As always, if you made it to the end of these videos, thank you so much for watching, and keep hacking away at that backlog.